There is a tale of ancient descent, one whose origin stretches back into the forgotten vistas of antiquity, far, far before the master of mankind walked openly amongst us, and long before the ruinous descent of the Age of Strife tore humanity's golden age asunder. From beyond even the darkest days of the Age of Technology, this tale from the cradle of old Earth, a fragment of folklore preserved through the millennia, tells of a round table. At this singular hearth sat the most noble of beings, warriors who upheld the unyielding laws of their land and swore absolute fealty to a legendary throne. Bound by sacred oaths of justice and the defence of the weak, they rode out into the wilderness upon great flesh and blood equines in an era before gene sculpting and the cybernetic cavalry of today. Clad in the brightest, most decorated armour, tacked with a literal and symbolic beacon of hope. These legendary archetypes wandered the vastness of ancient Terra, seeking a holy relic on behalf of their sovereign king. It is a cup or chalice of some description, a vessel deeply tied to the superstitious and long-dead faith of that primitive time. Yet they pursued this grand quest not for personal accolades or accumulation of wealth, but for the spiritual preservation and betterment of their entire kingdom. It is a striking historical echo, for although those ancient riders are now but dust, their ideals of absolute fealty, chivalric duty, and martial sacrifice would eventually find themselves resurrected and magnified 1,000 times over, encased in the towering adamantium frames of the Imperial Knights. Though separated by 10,000 years and the cold, unyielding void of space, the Knights of the Emperor's Imperium share a profound genetic soul with these legendary champions of this bygone myth. To look upon a night world is to witness the romantic traditions reimagined in those old Earth fables, where ancient feudalism has been adapted to survive the harsh realities of a hostile galaxy. Where the chosen sat at the round table and bound themselves to sacred oaths, the nobles of the night houses tethered their minds to the throne Mechanicum. This ritualistic interface does far more than allow a pilot to control a multi-story engine of war. It actively floods their subconsciousness with the echoes of 1,000 ancestors, reinforcing a rigid, uncompromising code of honour, fealty and martial pride that mirrors the ideals of the old. Anchoring this entire martial culture is a complex web of allegiances to the cult Mechanicus, local forge worlds, and of course the distant throne world of Holy Terra, preserving the same feudal obligations that once defined the Fellowship of Old Earth. The immediate catalyst for this dive into the archives is a localised miracle that unfolded upon my own homeworld, the thunderous arrival of 2 Imperial Knights. They made landfall with all the grand pomp, rigid etiquette, and the ancient ceremony strictly demanded by their aristocratic status. Beholding these colossal engines with my own eyes offers a profound revelation of scale that no written archive could ever truly convey. The war machines currently gracing our soil are Armiger scouts, the blightest, most compact classification of knights in existence. But they still loom majestically over the staging grounds, serving as towering monuments of salvation reminiscent of the mythic guardians of times past. If these scouts represent the absolute nadir of their size, one's mind recoils at the thought of the grander classes. What are the titanic frames that dominate the front line, or the apocalyptic god engines of the Titan legions? To be suddenly confronted with the reality of these mechanical titans, and to fully comprehend the terrifying majesty of what actively strides across the stars, is an experience that completely overwhelms the human psyche. As the dust settled and the ground ceased its trembling, the experience has left me deeply curious. Rarely within the sprawling annals of our Imperium are these mechanical knights granted the narrative weight they so clearly deserve. True glory within the official histories is a fiercely hoarded currency, traditionally lavished upon the transhuman fury of the Adeptus Astartes or pinned to the tragic, heroic martyrdom of the Imperial Guard. Meanwhile, the ever-present knights, who have spent millennia upholding the law and virtues of the Imperium while bleeding either for the Golden Throne or the Iron Will of Mars, are routinely relegated to the sidelines of our history books. They are reduced to a brief footnote at worst, or callously tallied amongst the mechanical inventory of the campaign at best. That is, of course, assuming the bureaucratic monolith of the Departmentum Unitorum deigned to log their contributions at all, given that the proud, fiercely independent knight houses exist as an entirely separate sovereign entities outside the standard imperial chain of command, and as such are not something the overburdened scribes would care to log. For the knight houses walk at their own leisure. And so I present my next penned work, a history of the Questor Imperialis and the Questor Mechanicus, an understanding of the feudal web of obligations of the knight houses and the dual loyalty of their lineage. To truly comprehend these walking bastions of adamantium and pride, one must first unravel the intricate feudal web of obligations they inhabit. Long before the rise of the Emperor, during the start of the Age of Technology, humanity reached out to the stars with an insatiable hunger to occupy new worlds. Vast colonization starships, packed with every resource required to forge civilization, launched into the void, making landfall on far-flung, profoundly isolated planets. For it is estimated at around M16, scouts from ancient Terra were sent to map worlds that could be tamed for architectural breadbaskets to feed mankind's exploding population, or carved open as mining colonies. When a planet ripe for habitation was found, these titanic spacecraft were dispatched from Terra's Long March fleets, a name that perfectly captures the grueling, decades-long journeys these colonists undertook. Upon arrival, there was no sentimentality, and no path retraced. The colony ships made their final landfall and were immediately stripped, cannibalized down to superstructure, all providing raw resources needed to erect the first settlements. But there was no turning back, and no hope of aid if things went wrong. The struggle for survival on these isolated spheres was dire. On some worlds, the settlers found themselves transformed overnight into prey, hunted through primordial wastelands by vicious predators that defied classification. On others, they were immediately assaulted by hostile native Xenos who viewed the human arrivals as existential invaders. On remaining worlds, catastrophic weather patterns or toxic atmospheres made venturing outside the fragile domed habitats a swift death sentence. But the architects of the Age of Technology had answers to these horrors. They started equipping the colonists with standard template constructs. These ancient wonders were databases and automated fabrication facilities designed to aid in humanity's survival in an increasingly hostile galaxy. To those who have not heard of an STC before, it is unsurprising, for knowledge of such things are well guarded by the cult Mechanicus. One does hope to obtain more information on this subject, but for now can be briefly explained as devices made as the ultimate testament to mankind's intellect. The standard template construct system was an extraordinarily advanced cogitator database designed to hold the sum total of human scientific, engineering, and technological knowledge. Introduced at the very peak of human interstellar civilization, before the catastrophic onset of the Age of Strife, the STC was a marvel of adaptive utility. It allowed frontier workers and colonists to construct anything their survival demanded, from a simple, reliable lasgun to a heavily fortified planetary bunker, or even the blessed blueprints of the interstellar warships that now form the backbone of the Navis Imperialis. Crucially, these systems did not merely store schematics. They possessed the dynamic capability to analyze localized, changing circumstances and engineer entirely new designs to overcome whatever hostile environments the colonists faced. The enduring genius of this ancient technology is woven into the very fabric of our current Imperium. Ubiquitous war machines such as the Rhino-armoured personal carrier, the frontline land raider, and the Titanic Baneblade super heavy tank are all direct products of the surviving STC fragments. To the tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus, these systems are not merely historical relics. They are the most holy artificial of artifacts. Divine gifts whispered to mankind by the machine god himself. Consequently, Imperial forces, driven by the zealots of Mars, will go to any imaginable length to recover a lost or stolen STC, or even a fragmented, fragile hard copy blueprint of a single design, treating the lives of hundreds of thousands of Imperial citizens as a cheap currency to be spent in the pursuit of such technology. The flimsiest, most distant rumours of a discovered STC system is enough to spark a cross-galaxy expedition, mobilising massive Crusade fleets and consume untold wealth and lives. Originally, an STC database was a standard tool, a piece of equipment possessed by every group of human interstellar colonists, serving as their mechanical lifeline on untamed alien worlds. However, during the lawlessness anarchy of the Age of Strife, these delicate systems fell into disuse. They sabotaged and were shattered by wars, growing increasingly rare until they all but vanished from the galaxy. In the grim reality of our time, after 10,000 Terran years of decay, the survival of an intact, functional STC is a near impossibility. What little technological understanding remains from that golden age survives as a fading shadow. Hard copies and corrupted schematics that have been meticulously preserved, obsessively copied, and fiercely guarded over millennia by the tech priesthood. Those who blindly worship the relics of an enlightened past that they no longer truly understand. With the assistance of these technologies, the early colonists created mechanized chassis of which to tame their environments. Protected by a hardened shell of plasteel and fully adaptable to utilise heavy machinery for resource gathering, or in times of defence a bristling array of industrial weaponry. These walking suits proved invaluable. To the vulnerable settlers, these towering armoured saviours became a ambiguous and comforting sight, earning the title of Knights, a deliberate romantic echo of the myths projected of ancient Terran lore. A knight suit is a apex weapon of staggering lethality. Yet without its noble pilot, it remains nothing more than a hollow, inert monument. The spiritual and physical anchor of any knightly house is the singular monolithic structure known simply as the Sanctuary. These dust-choked ancient bastions date back to the arrival of the original Long March colony ships. Within the heart of the Sanctuary lies the Chamber of Echoes, the designated vault where the young aspirants undergo a ritual of becoming. Upon reaching the appropriate age, a designated scion is surgically fitted with the cranial neural sockets and committed to a solitary night-long vigil, strapped into the detachable control cradle known as the Throne Mechanicum. Umbilical interface cables are coupled directly into their neural network, establishing a profound mind impulse link. Here, in the silent abyss of their own mind, they are merged with the consciousness of countless generations that came before them. The scion is weighed and judged by the electronical ghosts of the past. Their inherentmost thoughts, fears and secrets lay bare like an open book. The neurological feedback inherent to this process is so volatile that more than a tenth of all supplicants are either permanently driven mad or killed outright by massive cerebral aneurysms. For those that survive, the imprinting process leaves permanent psychological scars. Crucially, the throne permanently mirrors the exaggerated and dominant emotions of the young noble experiences during their vigil. If an aspirant succumbs to the trepidations of their duty, the throne will absorb the nervous disposition, rendering the knight temperamental in combat. When a pilot eventually dies, their consciousness creates their own permanent digital ghost. These ancestral echoes linger within the subroutines of the throne, whispering into the minds of subsequent generations and judging them in turn. Yet this neural dialogue is an active two-way passage. The moment a young noble achieves its successful synchronization, the device actively rewires the pilot's subconscious. It implants the absolute unbreakable devotion to the concept of feudal fealty, social hierarchy, and ancestral obligation. But the exact mechanics remain shrouded in antiquity. It is highly probable that these behavioural constraints were intentionally pre-programmed by the system's original architects during the age of technology, serving as a fail-safe to ensure these heavily armoured frontier guardians could never turn their weapons upon the civilian populations they were manufactured to protect. Should this neural link itself fail, either in active combat or out on patrol, every cockpit is outfitted with a physical array of manual controls. These configurations exist primarily for the hereditary artisans and technicians to manoeuvre the suits within maintenance berths. In practice, these physical inputs offer only clumsy rudimentary movements. Yet if a pilot is ever rendered thought dead, suffering a catastrophic severing of the mental connection during combat, They can fall back on these manual controls in a desperate emergency, moving with the mechanical stiffness of an Imperial Guard sentinel rather than the grace of archaeotech. Over the course of but a few generations, the mind-altering effects of the throne Mechanicum began to permanently reshape the colonist psychology. The neural feedback loop gradually evolved the frontier pilots into elite aristocratic knight houses. As the centuries rolled on, the utilitarian plasteel plates of the original frontier exoskeletons were replaced with ornate, master-crafted adamantium, transforming the machines into a grand panoply that displayed the wearer's prestige and social rank. The mundane and basic duties the early knights had performed, such as logging or blasting through rock strata, were delegated to the lower castes. This freed up the nobles to focus entirely on the arts of war and feudal governance. Now dwelling in soaring, heavily fortified strongholds, these nobles ruled over the settlers, whom they now viewed not as equal colonists, but as subjects under their house's protection. But as even a novice of history may tell you, the golden era of human advancement was destined for a catastrophic collapse. At M22, the cracks were starting to show, as the latent psychogene emerged from humanity for the first time. And by M25, the severing of the stars was complete, as the violent, impassable warp storms engulfed the galaxy, plunging humanity into a fractured lawlessness of the Age of Strife, or Old Night, churned by the slow, millennial gestation of the entity known as Slanesh, just prior to the cataclysmic fall of the debased Eldari Empire. While countless human civilizations collapsed into anarchy, madness, or xenos predation under the cover of this cosmic isolation, a significant number of night worlds endured. Their salvation lay not in innovation or any form of forward thinking, but in a rigid, deeply ingrained cultural conservatism and an absolute resistance to societal change. While more progressive worlds had historically embraced the dangerous utility of warp-attuned mutants and indulged in the decadent luxuries of sentient machinery that would turn upon their creators during the Machine Wars, the aristocratic rulers of the Night Worlds had aggressively rejected both trends. They stubbornly clung to the established tradition of the mechanical simplicity of their knights. Left entirely to their own devices, the martial elite consolidated absolute dominion over their respective populations. Across nearly every surviving world, this produced a highly structured, new feudal societal model. The ruling class resided within massive, heavily fortified bastions constructed directly atop landing sites of the original pioneer expeditions, incorporating the structural ribs and cannibalized hulls of the ancient colony vessels. Extending outwards from these fortified hubs were immense agricultural fields or colossal strip mining operations. It is within these zones that the overwhelming majority of the planetary baseline human populations spent their entire lives, with most individuals never venturing more than a few kilometers from their ancestral districts. Beyond the borders of this managed territory, the untamed wilderness was populated by massive herds of livestock, hunted frequently by enormous reptilian beasts, all seeded across the planets during humanity's first expansion as a food source, and as a likely form of gain for the nobles to hunt in their suits. These mechanical knights sit upon a massive logistical pyramid, composed of standard human men-at-arms, planetary levies, and specialized clans of hereditary artisans and mechanics. Over generations, these technicians became indispensable priestly castes within the feudal society, solely responsible for maintaining the temperamental machine spirits of these knight suits. Political stability within these knightly strongholds varied wildly. While some houses maintained unbroken hereditary succession for centuries, the vacancy of a throne frequently triggered intense political machinations, assassination plots, and localized civil wars amongst rival claimants. Furthermore, friction between distinct houses of the same planet was a permanent fixture of their existence. While catastrophic planet-wide wars were generally avoided through the rigid codes of conduct, rival factions constantly sought to outmaneuver one another through political intrigue or formalized martial claimants. As the centuries of isolation turned into millennia until their reunion with the wider galaxy, these societies became profoundly insular. Linguistic drift and cultural divergence created a fragmented tapestry of localized tradition. A planetary ruler might be revered as a lord on one world, a writer on another, or a patriarch on a third. Cut off from all forms of external stimuli, suffocating ritual and Byzantine etiquette came to dictate every facet of daily, aristocratic life. Those shackled nobles, the only true escape from the stifling paralysis of courtly traditions was to plug their minds into the throne Mechanicum and unleash their repressed fury upon the field of battle. By the time the Imperium was finally forged in M30, these night worlds had already stood as proud, self-sustaining bastions for thousands of years. Conducted by a singular vision of the Emperor, humanity embarked on its own grand exodus back into the void following the unification of Terra and the Solar Reclamation, launching the Great Crusade to gather the scattered remnants of the species under the single Raptor and Lightning Bolt banner. The immense strategic potential of these long-lost colonies was first brought to light when the rogue trader militant Jeffers orchestrated the historic Imperial rediscovery of a world known as Crisis. Because the rogue trader fleets were themselves comprised of ancient, powerful dynasties that survived the horrors of the Old Night and the fires of the Unification Wars, Jeffers possessed an innate, deep-seated understanding of aristocratic lifestyles, rigid traditions, and hereditary pride found on night worlds. Armed with this cultural kinship, and wielding the extraordinary, near absolute freedom and autonomy granted by his lineage by the Emperor's own hand, secured through the warrant of trade, Jeffers possessed the unique diplomatic finesse required to bypass superstition and negotiate his way inside the planet's closely guarded, deeply insular fortresses. Observing the towering war engines and the rigid hierarchy of its rulers, Jeffers recognised that these aristocratic martial lineages could serve as an invaluable asset to the Emperor's expanding armies. Agreeing with these assessments, the high bureaucrats of the Administratum initiated a systematic search to map the remaining enclaves. However, the merciless attrition of time had erased the vast majority from existence, leaving only a few hundred scattered survivors across the galaxy. Despite their immense geographical separation, these surviving planets maintained strikingly uniform characteristics, owing to the standardization of the blueprints used by their original founders. Most notable was the worship of the machine by those who serviced and maintained the knights themselves. Generations of artisans, having never seen a red-robed tech priest of Mars, had still formed separate pseudo-religious centres around the machine god. This introduced an intricate geopolitical nightmare upon rediscovery by the chaotic expansion of the Great Crusade. We are, after all, an imperium of two empires, that of Terra and that of Mars. Upon the initial contact of these isolated domains, a fierce, decades-long bureaucratic conflict erupted within the nascent Imperium, each side manoeuvring ruthlessly to monopolise the peerless martial resources the Knights represented. Despite the desperate attempts on both sides of the Imperial coin to gain favour, it ultimately came down to the basic notion of who arrived first. When a Night World chose to pledge its ultimate fealty to the Emperor, binding its lineage by sacred, blood-sworn oaths to the defence of Holy Terra, the relentless ambitions of the Mechanicum remained entirely undeterred. The tech priests simply adjusted their strategy, systematically establishing their own highly industrialised forge worlds within close astronomical proximity to these Terran-bound worlds, where they could quietly integrate themselves into local affairs by initiating lucrative trade agreements and aggressively excavating the planet's ancient colonial ruins for lost archaeotech. Conversely, the political architects of the early Imperium played this grand game of leverage with equal cunning, ensuring that if a night house profoundly proclaimed its primary allegiance to the Red Sands of Mars, Terra would deliberately manipulate the grand strategy of the Great Crusade to place that specific house in a compliance campaign directly alongside a Primarch. This calculated assignment was never a mere gesture of honour, but a calculated or inspiring demonstration of imperial majesty, designed to show the Martian Scions the true staggering scale of the Emperor's power and remind them exactly who commanded the ultimate destiny of the stars. The hypothetical of all this, however, is moot, for the night itself is a relic and bound by Mars, regardless of the loyalties of those who ride them. The artisans and maintenance crews of the Knights were quickly taken by the tech priests and indoctrinated into the cult Mechanicus. A near effortless endeavour, since, as mentioned, the worship of the machine in some form or another was already customary. Mars renamed the various titles given to these craftsmen across the multitudes of night worlds and their linguistic drifts to Sacristans, a title that was quickly absorbed into the vocabulary of the night houses themselves. Whenever a monolithic vessel of Mars makes landfall from a nearby forge world to collect its tithe, it also departs with a small contingent of young apprentices selected from the Might Worlds. These initiates are gathered from all tiers of local hierarchy. An apprentice might be the third-born offspring of a proud noble dynasty, or the child of a lowly agrarian serf. Over the course of a grueling solar decade-long apprenticeship within the industrial hives of the Forge world, they are painstakingly instructed in the complex engineering required to service the Knight chassis, eventually returning to the ancestral home as fully ordained Sacristans. This calculated education effectively implants a subterranean network of Martian agents across the galaxy, each uniquely positioned to subtly advance the geopolitical interests of the Tech Priesthood. The ancestral technician clans who patched the armour during the long isolation of the Old Knight had already cemented themselves as an indispensable pillar of the feudal estates. But the formal enlightenment provided by the Mechanicum dramatically elevated their social standing. From the moment of their reorganisation, the Sacristans structured themselves as an exclusive priesthood, guarding the half-forgotten mysteries of the technology they commanded. As their political leverage expanded, the dynamic between the artisans and the ruling elite fundamentally shifted. Where they were once viewed as the mere baseline subjects, or common vassals, the Sacristans learned to speak with a unified collective voice. By quietly threatening to withdraw their vital maintenance rights from any household that rejected their council, the Council of Mars, they quickly amassed a level of societal influence that rivaled the power of the nobles themselves. For the most part, this political equilibrium has stabilised Knight society. The Sacristans served as a sobering counterweight to the unbridled arrogance, hair-triggered tempers, and the warlike impulses of the warrior elite. But this also served as a double-edged sword, serving as the primary lever of control for the Mechanicum. The tech priests routinely manipulate this internal influence in an attempt to bend the fiercely independent Night worlds to the strategic will of Mars. More often than not, however, the nobles' deeply ingrained hardwired sense of personal honour and ancient duty drives them to pursue paths of martial righteousness that the calculating, cold-blooded magi of the Mechanicum would prefer they ignore. But the days of the Great Crusade, just as the epoch of the Dark Age of technology, were violently cut short by the ultimate betrayal, the Horus Heresy. A catastrophic fracture that plunged the galaxy into the most bitter and destructive civil war humanity had ever witnessed. Across the length and breadth of the infant Imperium, rebel forces clashed with those loyal to the throne in a desperate struggle for the very soul of mankind. Brother turned against brother on every front. Space Marines traded fury with Space Marines, and colossal titans traded apocalyptic fire with their fellows. Alongside these legendary hosts, knights locked lances with knights in a tragic war of houses divided, bound by oath deemed unbreakable. The wording of these oaths are what led the downfall to many. The knights who had previously declared their fealty to either Terra or Mars found themselves irrevocably shackled to that historical choice. The crisis forced an agonising existential calculus upon every household. If their sovereign forge world had pledged itself to Horus, did their ancient compacts with the tech priests override their duty to the Emperor? In turn, if a house was bound to Terra, what happened if the roads were tied to a specific Primarch or another imperial entity that now aligned itself with Horus and his legion of heretics? To those aristocrats, honour was not a concept to be debated, but now a trap from which there was no escape. Prior to the rebellion, many within the Imperium believed it was impossible for the noble houses to turn renegade. The throne's Mechanicum in which these pilots were bonded actively reshaped their psychology and neural architecture, deeply conditioning them against such thoughts of treason or sedition. Paradoxically, however, true to its programming, it was this exact hardwired devotion that led the houses straight into the arms of the archenemy. When a massive faction of the Mechanicum broke away to side with Horus, forming the Dark Mechanicum, many a Knight Household has sworn absolute fealty to those specific forge worlds and followed them into rebellion without hesitation. As the corrupted tech priests plunged their forbidden arts into this techno-sorcery, the Knights under their jurisdiction were systematically warped by the power of the Immaterium. Scrap code and profane runes defiled their hulls as they marched to war alongside the traitor Titan legions, leaving ruined the defenders of the throne. Other fallen houses met damnation by honouring their oaths to the space-bring legions that had turned renegade. The nobles of these dynasties followed their original martial codes to the letter, answering every call to arms and serving their commanders without question, oblivious to the fact that their unblinking obedience was guiding them to spiritual ruin. Still, other knights became outcasts, turning their weapons upon their own kin, forsaking family and friends and breaking all bonds of fellowship. Some of these lone renegades were broken by the insidious whispers of the maleficent entities haunting their dreams, while others were forcibly enslaved to the will of the ruinous powers through profane, sacrificial rituals. Thus the first Chaos Knights were forged, and in the 10,000 standard years that have followed, these corrupted engines have continued to stalk the stars, leaving a legacy of absolute terror and butchery in their wake. It would be unwise to dwell on such blasphemy. In due time, a dedicated chronicle documenting the tragic corruptions of the dread Chaos Knights will be compiled, but that dark chapter is not for now. Ever since the cataclysmic fracture of the Horus Heresy, the Night Worlds have relentlessly consolidated their position as a vital, fiercely loyal bedrock of the Imperium. Feared across 1,000 battlefields for their terrifying martial efficiency and notoriously unswayable once their sacred word has been given, these armoured lineages are embraced as premier allies by Imperial commanders whenever their services can be successfully requisitioned. It is only the relative scarcity of these surviving worlds, coupled with the rigid, pathological, hidebound nature of their societies, that prevents the Imperial Knights from exerting a total, definitive hegemony over the galaxy. Within the shadowed halls of a knightly stronghold, daily life is entirely subjugated to a suffocating matrix of ancient traditions and bespoke rituals. Many of these customs have endured, wholly unaltered, for over 10,000 standard years, enforced by a ruling class that views any deviation as an unforgivable stain upon their ancestral honour. This extreme cultural conservatism manifests as an omnipresent liturgical burden, entirely consuming the waking hours of the court. Entire days are squandered tending to the obscure, esoteric tenets of a household protocol or performing elaborate veneration rites for the ancestors who turned to dust millennia ago. For the shackled nobility, the only true escape from this paralysing courtly routine lies in the crucible of conflict, either through the heroic high-stakes theatre of frontline planetary combat, via the more insidious, yet no less intoxicating, political warfare waged behind closed doors. The first of these escapes remains the exclusive, jealously guarded privilege of the direct heirs of the house, for only they are permitted to undergo the bonding rituals required to pilot the knight suits. At court, every gesture, utterance and posture is rigidly policed by a Byzantine social etiquette. The moment they plug into the throne Mechanicum, however, that stifling cage evaporates. Enclosed in adamantium, they are entirely free to act as they see fit, answerable to nothing but the voice of their ancestors and their own moral compass. Confronted with this sudden, godlike autonomy, it is little wonder that Imperial Knights fight with such ruthless, joyful ferocity, or that they obsessively hone their combat doctrines until their martial prowess rivals even the transhuman perfection of the Adeptus Astartes. Yet there is a darker, more predatory facet to the aristocratic character, one that fuels a parallel mechanism for escaping the monotony of courtly life. The exact same subconscious conditioning wrought by the throne Mechanicum that implants an ironclad respect for the hierarchy and fealty carries a profound psychiatric side effect. It renders the nobles pathologically, endlessly ambitious. Every scion is psychologically compelled to outshine their peers, to hoard prestige, and to be universally recognised as the apex predator of their lineage. While this neurosis directly fuels their obsession with martial combat, it manifests with equal intensity as the venomous devotion to political intrigue. Consequently, the grand courts of the knightly houses are permanently fractured into cutthroat political syndicates, each scheming tirelessly to humiliate and outmaneuver the others. These shadow wars are by no means limited to the pilots themselves. Every highborn lord maintains a political strategic consort, producing male heirs to inherit the family titles and daughters to be bartered away as political currency to rival dynasties. All is considered a foundational duty for the house. For these highborn consorts, political manipulation offers the single viable antidote to the stultifying drudgery of their ceremonial existence. History records many a low-ranking noble who ascended to the planetary throne solely through the calculated intelligence and cold-blooded cunning of their partners, along with their own ruthless ambition. As a result, labyrinthian plots and lethal conspiracies saturate the highest echelons of knightly society. While the majority of these internal feuds are ultimately inconsequential, resulting in nothing more than a temporary shift in courtly prestige, as mentioned at the start of this record, they can instantly turn catastrophic when a ruling monarch dies without a clear line of succession. In such volatile vacuums, it is common for rival factions to mobilise their house levies to open violence, or to orchestrate a clinical assassination of a hated political opponent, though, thankfully, such outcomes are rare. Ultimately, to gaze upon an Imperial Knight is to look directly through a distortion in time, witnessing a living synthesis of humanity's techno-industrial zenith as romantic ancient folklore. They are walking contradictions, engines of absolute staggering lethality, guided by an internal moral architecture that is as unyielding as it is archaic. Long before he who sits upon the Golden Throne launched his great endeavour to reclaim the stars, these proud insular houses were already standing as solitary sentinels against the suffocating terrors of the void. They weathered the absolute ruin of the old knight, not through progressive innovation, but through a fanatical, culturally ingrained conservatism, turning their isolated domains into fortress worlds that refused to break. The complex dual loyalties that define their existence, caught between the blood oaths of the Imperial throne and the sacred technological reliance on the forge worlds of Mars, is the natural evolution of culture built entirely upon the bedrock of feudal obligation. Whether marching beneath the standard of the Questor Imperialis or the Questor Mechanicus, the noble pilots remain fundamentally unchanged. They are the hereditary guardians of the internal frontier, bound by the digital ghosts of 1,000 ancestors whispering from the subroutines of the throne Mechanicum. Though the official histories compiled by the bureaucrats may routinely relegate these walking bastions to the dry margins of campaign inventories, their true legacy cannot be so easily erased by the administrator's quill. As stated at the start, they walk at their own leisure. As long as the reactors of these towering god machines continue to roar across the battlefield, the ancient code of the Round Table will endure, magnified 1,000 times over, encased in adamantium, and striding proudly into the relentless fury of an unforgiving galaxy. Remember, knowledge is power. Guard it well. And so this record may now be sealed in the Emperor's name. To appease the algorithmic machine spirit and ensure it recognises your service, register your credentials or preferred seal in the comments below. Your feedback and support is genuinely appreciated. I would like to extend my never-ending gratitude to my Patreon subscribers, a sentence I never would have thought I would ever get to say. To join those most noble master scholars, visit patreon.com/Historitor Corbe Moore. Keep this transmission array running and Sacred Vellum fresh. Or you can join me on Twitter or TikTok at @MoreCorvo. The links, as ever, are in the details below. But our work never ends. Your clearance has been extended to the next prioritised file appearing on your boxcast now. Proceed onwards, dearest listener, for our vigil continues. I shall join you in the next one.